Two, one. Hi there, everybody. My name is Dr. Laurence Peters. I'm with the Johns Hopkins School of Education, and I'm here with a distinguished panel: Dana Mortensen from World Savvy, Kirsten Hagen, a specialist at global studies in DC Public Schools, and Jennifer Adams, program director with the Global and International Education Department at Drexel University. I'm so excited to have this brilliant group of global experts here who really have shaped a lot of my thinking about global. And let's get these slides. So without further ado, I've taught Introduction to Global Education at Johns Hopkins for about 8 years. And I kind of shaped my thinking that's gone into the book, Creating the Global Classroom, from the experience of doing that seminar. Sometimes we've been online, sometimes we've been face-to-face. Sometimes I've taught groups of Chinese students, largely Asian students, I should say. And sometimes I've taught Americans. And so it's really fueled some of the content in the book. And I'd like to introduce now Dr. Jennifer Adams, and we'll just go through the list, and she can say a little bit about her work and hand it off to Dana and then Kirsten.
Hi, I'm so happy to be here today. I am Jennifer Adams, and I'm an associate professor and also the program director for global and international education at Drexel University, where I teach courses on international and comparative education, quantitative methods, and also survey research. I've worked in this field for about 20 years, first as a teacher and school leader in East Asia, and also for many years as an educational researcher, primarily in rural China, but in more recent years, I've become interested in the idea of global citizenship education. I've been doing some cross-national research with one of my PhD students, Kathleen Elliott, to explore global citizenship identification and the role that it might play in fostering other educational outcomes that we really care about, such as students like climate literacy. And I also have 2 small research projects where I investigate the links between environmental literacy and global citizenship education, as well as climate change education in the Bahamas and in Israel. And I think that work is really important. And I think actually the work of Dr. Peters and his book really resonated with me in thinking about this work, because I've been really conceptualizing environmental literacy as something that's beyond knowledge and awareness, but instead thinking about the ways that global citizenship identification as sort of a normative environment for students really helps students perceive themselves as world citizens, and in turn, they might be able to feel this psychological connection with global citizens as a group. And I've become more interested in the potential of global citizenship education and global education broadly to really motivate students towards environmentally beneficial patterns of behavior by really inspiring positive feelings that are associated with being part of a group and contributing to the global community at large. And so with that in mind, I'm really thrilled today to talk with this wonderful group of experts and scholars about the importance of global ed, and also to think a little bit strategically about how to ensure access to global educational experiences for all students. So I'm going to pass it on to Dana.
Thanks, Jennifer, and thanks, Dr. Peters and Kirsten. It's really a pleasure to be with you all today, talking about this critical topic. My name's Dana Mortensen. I'm the co-founder and CEO of World Savvy. We are a national education nonprofit, celebrated our 20th year in operation just this year. We work across the US, have reached 45 states to help schools and districts deeply embed global competence into teaching, learning, and culture. So we have a systems approach to how we essentially integrate this deeply into how we define what a quality education is. At the student level, we work with young people through a knowledge to action framework that lets them identify, issues they care about in the community, connect those issues to what's happening around the world, and then develop the capacity and the skills to take positive action, whether that's in their backyard or it is across the country or the world. We also work with teachers to help them build a teaching practice that centers global competence in what they're doing to build connection in the classroom, to create culturally responsive spaces and inclusive spaces and equitable spaces, and also sort of move from an industrial model of education where we have a sage on the stage to more of a meddler in the middle that can facilitate and leverage the diversity in the classroom as an asset. So we do that through workshops, instructional coaching for educators, and a variety of online coursework and communities of practice. And then we also support leaders. We support district and school leaders to understand how this gets embedded institutionally across how schools operate. That includes everything from strategy to assessment to understanding what authentic community collaboration and engagement looks like. And over the years, that's evolved most recently to even working with families and parent-teacher organizations, and most recently school boards, helping to bring school boards into the conversation about how you prioritize and center this so it isn't niche and extra and nice to have, but rather the must-have of the work. So my personal passion is really, and we'll get to this later, is talking about how we really think about global education as education in the world that we live in. The adjective is important, but at the same time, really what we're thinking about is a world that's rapidly changing, where most of the students identify as BIPOC, more than a quarter are speaking a language other than English. And so as we think about, and we'll talk about this today, I'm excited about it, our work is really around how to make this sticky and accessible and meaningful and resonant, wherever you are, whatever your identity is as a student or an educator or school leader or community member. So I'm really excited to dig in with this amazing group, and I'll pass it off to Kirsten.
Thank you, Dana, and good afternoon. I'm really excited to be a part of this conversation with Dana and Jennifer and Dr. Peters. My name is Kirsten Hagen, and I'm the manager of global education for DC Public Schools. And so DC Public Schools is a school district of about 50,000 students and about 117 schools in our nation's capital. The Global Education Office is a 3-person office. It's housed in DCPS's central office. So we work across the district to try to create global opportunities for all students in the district. I'm going to highlight just a few of the different initiatives that we have as part of our DCPS Global Education team and program. And the first is our Embassy Adoption Program. So this is our longest running program. It started in 1974, before we even had a global education office. It's a partnership with Washington Performing Arts. And it pairs 5th and 6th grade classrooms with an embassy partner, and they have visits throughout the year to learn about the country and culture. So sometimes those visits will be at the school, and sometimes those visits will be at the embassy. Throughout COVID, they were virtual visits for the students. At the end of the year, the students put together a capstone presentation, and they also participate in a Model UN with students across the district representing their countries. We also have a Global Educator Pathway Fellowship program. And so this is a teacher fellowship. This is one of our newer initiatives. It focuses on embedding global education into teachers' teaching practice and curriculum. So it's open to teachers across the district, different grade levels, different content areas. And it really focuses on teachers developing their own global competency and then bringing it into their classroom through their lessons and through unit development. We piloted this program last year with about 10 teachers, and then over the summer, the teachers worked together to really develop the program that we will be running this year. We also have global studies schools. We currently have 3 global studies schools, and this is a school-wide model that's focused on global education. This started in 2016 as a partnership with Project Zero. And in this, schools develop their own global identity based on their specific school community. Schools have a designated coordinator who work with the administration, teachers, students, parents, and partners to really bring global education into the school, school-wide, and into the classroom. A big part of this is the ongoing professional development for teachers. Coordinators do a lot of that work. They work with our office to put those on. And another big piece is the global partnerships and experiences. We also have our study abroad program, which started in 2016. The goal of this program is to make global travel the exception rather, or the expectation, sorry, rather than the exception. And it specifically targets students with limited travel experience. It's a fully funded program for 8th and 11th graders. So it covers hotels, airfare, entrance fees, meals, but also passports, and then travel supplies for students in need. This happens throughout the summer, and we have teachers that accompany the students as travel ambassadors. To date, we've had over 1,800 travelers. We've gotten students over 1,000 passports, and we've been to 18 different countries on 5 continents. And last year we were able to resume, but we did domestic programs. This year, we're looking forward to being able to travel internationally again. And then finally, we also have virtual exchanges. Right now, we've been working with IREX on the World Smart STEM Challenge. So that pairs students in the US with students in Ghana. They focus on the Sustainable Development Goals, and they come up with a prototype to address a challenge in one of their communities. And then we also work with Empatico on the Coding with Empathy Challenge. So they have a curriculum that's built around building empathy and also teaches students with their partners in Egypt a bit about coding. So those are just some of our initiatives, and I'm excited to continue this conversation.
Wow. Thank you so much, Kirsten. Thank you, everybody. This is going to be a great discussion. I'm just going to start it off by talking generally about my book, and then hopefully you'll pick up on some themes that you'd like to talk about some more. But the reason why I wrote the book, one of the reasons, is the profound notion that we're teaching in our schools so many single story narratives about the world, particularly about the US, that no longer work. They no longer fit the world. The world has grown. We're no longer at the center of the world, if we ever were. And certainly white Anglo-Saxons are not at the center of the world anymore. We have to understand that the students who are growing up now are in a global economy. We know that, but they have to we have to walk the walk and talk the talk. And one of my other big points are that the recent global PISA test, if anybody knows something about PISA, you'll know that it's a very well-respected assessment that's done every 2 years. And last year, they started a new test. It's usually math and science that they're testing, but they added global competency into the test that they use. And some revealing information was coming out of that, that the curriculum is not the key factor in developing global competency, but rather it's attitudes and human contact that's important. And we kind of underestimate that. And I think Kirsten is a very good example, her program, of realizing the need for that international contact, that you have to have schools that are open to visitors from other countries. And you have to also not tokenize, things in terms of festivals. We celebrate, Mexican food. We have to do a little bit more than that. And we can talk a little bit about how you can do that. The two leading challenges is there's now a certain reaction against multiple perspective taking. And I'm hoping Dana can talk a little bit more about that. We're living in a world where Americans feel a little, what should I say, insecure, feeling that the white culture is being undermined by talking about multiple perspectives, talking about different stories about slavery, for example. There's been a reaction against the word global, and I think we need to not just dismiss that, but understand how to react and respond. And a second challenge ahead we'll talk about is how to evaluate all this. What does it mean when you do bring a visitor into another classroom, when you do hold a model UN club? What does it mean when you do introduce Zoom collaborations or other kinds of technical collaborations with students from other countries. When you do project-based learning alongside students from countries in Africa and India. So, and then there's the importance of whole school approaches and the kind of ways in which schools themselves are kind of cultural. They send cultural messages to people as to how open and how multicultural they really are. And we can talk about that. So my aim in the book was to move beyond global education as an optional extra. That's been the tendency since about the 1970s, when global education kind of first hit people's consciousness. I think we need to really understand that global education needs to be embedded in a whole school culture and a global mindset, and that all teachers need to be global teachers. They need to understand the impact of their own discipline area, even math, to their role and relationship to a world culture. So I alluded to simple narratives. The past few decades, many of us believed in a simple, attractive story. Reality hit, we have this whole nationalist reaction. We had Brexit, we have Trump, we have Le Pen, we have Putin, all with their single story narratives. And they usually resolve in, our country's great, we need to go back to some earlier greatness, and let's kind of rewrite our story in those terms. And they're bubble worlds. Today, Putin is not alone. He uses power like other authoritarians, and he just keeps saying to his people, in terms of the propaganda that he's using, that we are somehow exceptional. And we've heard the word exceptional applied to American culture. Now, there's an issue there, and we can talk more about that. But we can't ignore it. I think schools cannot ignore the world we live in, the realities, the political realities of those worlds. And it's also worth referring to how students themselves react to all this. Sometimes they retreat into their own bubble worlds. Social media fosters that to some extent. But there's certain moral, I think they have a certain sense of morality, that certain things are not right. For example, climate change. We can't ignore climate change. We can't ignore Black Lives Matter and discrimination. We can't ignore gun violence. They want some kind of role in this world. They don't want to be taught at and lectured to. They want action, and they see there's a kind of impatience there. And I think that moral issue, again, cannot be dismissed easily, should not be dismissed. And I think if we really understand the world a little bit, we understand there is a moral dimension to many of these global issues, to just the idea of inequality around the world. Very sensitive to this word inequality. What does it mean? How can we bridge that gulf? Well, it begins by not othering people, by not seeing people as different fundamentally from ourselves, that they all have human needs. And to look at a document like the UN Charter, to look at the UN Declaration of Human Rights, to look at the actual protections and foundations of our moral understanding of the obligations we owe to others, of all kinds of ethnic backgrounds, of all kinds of nationalities. And not ignoring that, not just sweeping that and saying, well, that was a document, it was written, it was signed. Actually, it was signed by Russia, or the Soviet Union as it then was. This is the UN Declaration of Human Rights, and signed by China. And that's a fundamental historical document that is still law in terms of many countries embedding that in their own constitutions. So, skip this. We talked about this. So I'm hoping Dana will address this issue of the Anglo-centric story and what we can do about trying to combat that. The combat on the critical race theory, the book banning that's going on, this notion that you can close your doors, close your mind to a teeming and a multicultural, diverse world is not practical. But how do we do it? And again, I go back to the issue of what does this all mean in terms of assessment? Everybody wants to assess what are how we are making a difference. And we can't test score our way out of this. There are attitudes and changes that take place inside children's minds. How do we assess that? How do we count that? How does it feature into our calculations? Okay, so I go to Martin Barrett here, who I think has written very well about global competence. It's essential that we do conduct assessments of democratic, intercultural, and global competence, because we know that assessment has significant effects on behavior of both teachers and students. If something is not assessed in formal education, it's usually undervalued and fails to receive attention. And we all know how that works. And I'm just going to state a few things, just a final comments here about the PISA global literacy findings that I alluded to earlier. Students who reported having contact with people or individuals from a culture different from their own performed higher in numerous aspects of global competence. These students reported having higher levels of interest in learning about and respect for other cultures, and perhaps more importantly, performed higher on skills assessment of cognitive adaptability, the ability to adapt their thinking and behavior to new and challenging situations, and perspective taking. And that, I think, is a very important finding. The human connections that we make in schools is not trivial. It's non-trivial. It's very fundamental. And one of the assessments in the PISA analysis is the intercultural attitudes of teachers is a significant school variable. If you have teachers who are welcoming the world, who have had experience living in other countries, that makes a huge difference on students' attitude. Very hard to assess, but it's a school factor. And clearly it's something we need to take into account more. So I'm a big believer, my last point is going to be collaboration, that the big insight from Piaget onwards is that the most important aspect of the human development is when a child becomes social and attends school. That fundamentally changes the brain. I want to similarly pose that if you are in conversation on a regular basis with people from different cultural backgrounds, that fundamentally changes your attitudes and approaches to the way you solve problems, the way you see problems. And there are a number of ways in which you could do that in the classroom. We can talk a little bit more about that. It's beginning to understand that people from different cultures and backgrounds have different viewpoints, that there's not this one story, one morality, one view of the world that counts. If we're going to be global citizens, and I think several of you alluded to that, several panels alluded to the global citizenship issue, we're going to have to get practice at understanding and discussing other people's viewpoints. But you can't do that in a vacuum. You've got to do that with people. And the new technology obviously is a lot more robust than it ever was and allows for that. And the only thing that's lacking is our imagination about how we can move that agenda forward. So without further ado, I want to get some reactions to what I've said from the panel. So we'll start with, who are we going to start with? Jennifer, would you?
I can jump in.
Yeah, Chris, go ahead.
Yeah, there's so much to react to, Dr. Peters, and obviously as a group of individuals that are all very much invested in global education sort of being the default norm experience for young people. There's a lot to go. I want to, just for our audience, I'm imagining there's a lot of that, a lot of what you've said resonated with them too, to sort of come back out and think about to this idea of a single narrative around we're operating in a system that really is no longer relevant, right? We developed, it was an industrial era model that essentially was designed to be standardized. And we are working our way out of how that applies to a complex and uncertain and often volatile world. And in the process, the United States is trying to figure out how to be a multi-ethnic democracy, right? So if we go back to the purpose of education and we place it in the context of what the world looks like now, that's where I think, the urgency of global education really takes center stage. You can look at it through a few sort of simple lenses. One, you've got an estimated 85% of jobs that grade schools will hold that don't exist yet, right? So the content that you're learning, the technical knowledge is much less important than the competencies, the adaptability that you referenced. And so how you design learning so that young people can be cognitively nimble, can learn and unlearn and relearn and adapt is it complete odds with how the K-12 system was actually designed to function in sort of single subjects, including this solution-oriented, sort of interdisciplinary, action-oriented lens that you mentioned. So right now, that's one data point. The other is that who is in classrooms is fundamentally different. And it doesn't matter where you live in the United States. As I mentioned, we've worked for the last 20 years across the country in rural, urban, and suburban areas. And here in Minnesota, you're as likely to find, a school in Faribault, Minnesota, a tiny, predominantly homogenous white town for decades, that has enrolling 25% Somali students, right? We've got a quarter of our students across the country speaking a language other than English at home right now. And we've got more than half of students that identify as Black, Indigenous, people of color who are more representative of the global majority, right, than the dominant white culture that the system was designed to serve. So I think even those two pieces, never mind the challenges you brought up around climate and poverty and a global pandemic and health that require this sort of interdisciplinary and borderless collaboration. So when we think about bringing this in, I think to your point around the single narrative, we tend in our culture right now to have this aversion to complexity, right? We want black and white, we want good and evil. This is the right thing, that's the wrong thing. We designed schools to test. Here's the content you need to know. There's a right answer, there's a wrong answer. But everybody in this room knows that fundamentally the world that we're encountering doesn't have clean right and wrong answers or clean solutions. There's an unknown territory. So this aversion to complexity combined with we're a young country trying to figure out being a multi-ethnic democracy, and K-12 education has almost become sort of the proxy war for how people are slugging that out. And so to your point, just for the audience to consider, last year there were 1,579 books threatened with a ban. That is more than any of the 20 years prior since they began measuring it. So again, in a world where you need broadening perspectives to address these issues, there is an effort to narrow perspectives and control what students have access to and can see. And to be frank, banned books in the era of the internet is, somewhat hilarious, to be quite frank. We have 36 states with legislation moving through in full or part. Some have adopted it that are limiting the ability to talk about race or racism, right? And again, this population in classrooms is a majority of individuals that are either directly descended from enslaved people in this country or connected to cultures that have been impacted by colonization and other things that have created their identities and life stories. And so that 36 states, the majority of states are contemplating it. And there are 238 bills right now that are limiting the ability to talk about LGBTQ students and families' experiences. So literally the ability to recognize the whole student or whole person in a classroom via these legislation is being cut off. So this idea of that single narrative, to your point, I think you use this word, and I think it's really important to think about is it's not practical, right? If the purpose of education is to prepare young people for this world, what we've described, the momentum towards this interconnectedness, via technology and quite frankly, proximity. I live in Minnesota, and some of the fastest diversifying areas of our country are areas that were historically quite homogenous, right? It's the middle of the country. It's your Indianas, your Iowas, your Minnesotas. It's not just New York City and Texas and California. So if we're thinking about the purpose of education through this idea of a single narrative, it literally isn't serving it's fundamentally not serving who's in classrooms. And I think what global education has the opportunity to do, and I'd love to hear from my esteemed colleagues about this, is the tendency to have a pendulum swinging education reform conversation in the United States. Let's do STEM. We take our eye off the ball on civics. We have an insurrection. Now let's do more civics, right? This kind of framework, we use a global competency matrix to say, this isn't an either or, put this on the chop. It's a framework for thinking about the essential skills, behaviors, attitudes, dispositions that you need to navigate that world that's more diverse, that's more interconnect. And it doesn't matter if you're in an arts magnet school, or if you're in a STEM school, or if you're preparing to be a doctor or a lawyer or someone who works on HVAC systems, right? These things are all important because they're not just across the world. They are in our most intimate family relationships. They're in our neighborhoods. They're in our backyards. So through that lens of sort of either civic agency or workforce readiness, like this is, I think global education has the opportunity to bridge a lot of this sort of disparate trends.
Let's, Kirsten, how's DC been able to navigate through this? Do you recognize some of the issues that, first of all, Dana's talking about, and then how have you responded in DC to some of that?
Yeah, I think DC is kind of in a unique position in terms of our location. We're a very international city, but also, you know, in terms of the goals of the district of DCPS. So DCPS's stated aspiration is to become a whole child anti-racist district. So we have a ways to go with that, but I think we are actively looking at those structures that have historically and continue to affect our students of color particularly. And so I think as part of that, we're also looking at the social, emotional, academic development of students. And that's really a push in the district right now. And so one thing that we're looking at is how that aligns really well with global education and global competencies. And as the district is looking at that and coming up with targets for that, how we can make sure that we can make that alignment explicit. So that's what we've been doing in our office. But I do think that DC is a bit of a unique district.
Jennifer, from your perspective, have you seen any other countries with similar issues, or how have they dealt with some of those?
Yeah, I actually have. And this is like, it's such I feel like you're so much of what you said resonated with me, and like what the conversations are, I think, that are happening like in the global discourse. Yeah. But also really interesting to hear about Dana and Kirsten's experiences like in this space in the US. I think that many countries are dealing with how not to marginalize global education, which is a theme that came out in your book. And I think has also been mentioned by Dana. I think the work that Kirsten's doing in DC is so impressive, but I also think it's illustrative of how decentralized education is in the US compared to many other countries. And so, for example, we do see countries as like resource constrained to say countries like Uganda or Cambodia, where the Ministry of Education is saying, hey, we're doing this. This is important, right? And schools, although they're struggling, like they have it sort of in the mission and aspirationally, and they're struggling with how do we do this? And what actually really is this? Which I think is another question we want to ask a little bit. This is sort of conceptual clarity that might be needed. But I think in the US, we don't actually have that sort of national mandate to sort of take on these types of tasks. And so I think that's a little bit interesting. One of the other things that also sort of jumped out at me is that I think many of the places where countries around the world are struggling with implementing global citizenship education, which is where a lot of the global ed work is happening because of the Sustainable Development Goals and Target 4.7 that is pushing the linkages between global citizenship education and sustainability around the world, is with teacher preparedness and teacher readiness to take on these topics. Yeah. I think that links to with what Dana was talking about the sort of growing diversity of the students in classrooms around the world, not just in the US, and also the complexity of what education has become as we grow to understand that our educational system and sort of future ready education has to push us beyond these like single answers and single narrative approaches to education teachers often don't have the preparation to be teaching like in that space. And so I think the work that is either happening in DC public schools with the global pathway that Kirsten was talking about, and the work that World Savvy is doing, I think is really important because teachers need to be figuring out how to actually integrate this into their work. And I think that also links to some of the questions you raised earlier also about measurement and assessment, and also about how to span the curriculum rather than silo the sort of global education space. So we see these issues lots of places, I guess.
Can you point to a country that's leading, in certain areas in particular?
Well, I think that's a little bit complicated because I do think that there's a lack of agreement with about what global education is, right? And so we see these discussions about competencies, about increased empathy, critical thinking, communication, collaboration, conflict resolution. Many countries can get on board, I think, with those topics a little easier than some of the work about embracing human rights and peace, and in some places the terms like different types of inclusion, right? And so I do think we do see countries sort of cherry picking what they are comfortable with in this space. But one of the countries I would actually look to is actually Japan, that has actually been working very hard in the whole school approach to global citizenship education, and also with integrating global education into diverse parts of their curriculum about multiple topics rather than sort of adding it as a subject. So,
Dana, I know you're very sensitive to language and to terms that are used. Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think everything, Jennifer and Kirsten, that you said resonates with me. And Jennifer, I think the decentralization is absolutely a piece of it. And language does matter because, I spent, 10 years, sort of traveling around where most of the conferences were sort of East Coast, or, the theory and the thought and the debate about this wasn't necessarily inclusive, right? You didn't have folks from Nebraska and New Mexico, sort of rural communities that were involved saying, what makes this resonant? And so an example I'd give is in one of the states that we work that is, I would say it engaged in some of the politically contentious activity I mentioned, inclusion is a trigger word, but belonging is not, right? And so one of our ways of understanding how to help, most of the fundamental core things we're talking about, school leaders and district leaders and educators want for young people, right? They want them to be able to collaborate, communicate well. But there's a fear, and to Jennifer's point, a lack of, teacher ed hasn't necessarily caught up with this as a fundamental pillar of what a practice looks like in its fullest form. And so what we're doing now is trying to map how is, for lack of a better word, how do you create messaging that's resonant to communities, right? Without coming in and saying, let's start with the Sustainable Development Goals framework, right? But mapping back to them, right? To say anything that's in the SDGs, poverty, health, human rights are happening at the community and most local level, right? So how do you allow communities to develop their own ability to find connective tissue and use language that resonates for them? So we don't force necessarily, the way that we get in, and we have educational principles that include cultivating connections, right? That's a different way of saying, how do you understand who's in your community, who's in your classroom, who's in the school, and leverage the diverse identities and perspectives as an asset? Like, what does that look like? How do you build trust? So I think that's very much happening here too, Jennifer, where it's like, districts have to figure out and I would say school boards have a big role in the United States right now, in sort of pushing against some of the language.
Have you come across a school board or school district or a particular school that is doing a great job in any of these areas?
Yeah, I mean, I think we're new to the school board work. What I would say there is there's two sort of things happening. What's getting the most news is folks who are sort of battling a school board that might want to, take down a Black Lives Matter poster or pursue an anti-CRT agenda without even full understanding of what that means in a lot of cases. There's the other that's trying to work with school boards that are moving them out of a single vision of like the test scores, like how do you expand a worldview around measuring what matters to your assessment conversation. And I think there's some good work happening. There's some leaders around the country that we've worked with at the district level who are really trying to do that with school boards, saying, how do we define thriving and how do we use measurements outside this very, very small siloed bit. In other cases, we have partners like Byram Hills that's in New York that they started with a global scholars program that now more than a third of the students are in, but are now figuring out how do you mainstream and sort of percolate that throughout so that it's not sort of an aside or something you opt into, but something everybody experiences. We've seen great work there. And I think in general, to come back to the whole school, I think it is critical to be working at multiple levels, particularly with, right now we've got 30% of teachers that are leaving the profession. We've got an average turnover for superintendents of less than 3 years, right? So multiple levels of work that embeds this is important as well.
Let me switch topic for a minute. Collaboration. Kirsten, can you talk to that issue? Is that, that's my big hobby horse. I believe that collaboration and this project-based learning that has a global dimension is really helpful. Well, what's DC's interest in that?
Yeah, I think so. When you say collaboration, I think back to before I was in global ed, I was a middle school teacher, and I think about my background was in Middle Eastern studies. I studied abroad. I always wanted to bring that global perspective to the classroom, but sometimes as an individual trying to do that, it can feel kind of isolating and overwhelming. It can feel like that add-on. So I think when you say collaboration, that is something that we're really trying to do. And I'm not going to pretend like we have everything figured out. We're starting small. And that was the feedback that we received from our pilot fellowship with teachers. We wanted to have teachers from across the district so that we had people that are advocating for global education in different schools. But when you have that, it still can feel kind of isolating. So what we're doing with this next fellowship is we're really spending the second half of the fellowship focusing on having PLCs with teachers where they're working together on their lessons to try to think through how they can make them more global. And then they're going to take them into their classrooms and reflect and then work on lessons. So we're trying to build that space, but it's still starting small.
So you're embedding the professional development and curriculum together in a way that makes sense to teachers who are really busy and can't really focus on new stuff as much, and you kind of make it easier for them to transition to move into this new space.
That's our hope. So
if I can piggyback Dr. Peters, I love what you mentioned, Kirsten, about we take something like collaboration, Jennifer, to your point around how what does it mean and how do we nail it down? One of the things I'm really fond of is not just thinking about collaboration in the context of global collaboration and the SDGs, but embedding it into sort of the daily routinized practice of how school operates. So the district that I mentioned did a design challenge to start that engaged their students with other students in thinking about how they'd set up a master schedule that allows for 21st century learning, right? So just flexing the muscle of design thinking and collaboration and opening up. The next time they applied that was around voting rights and the census and inclusion in their community. So, I think when folks hear global education or teachers hear it, they think we're going to jump to talking about genocide or, the building of the competencies happens. It's 1,000 small moves, right? It's not just one overhaul.
Okay. That's well taken.
Can I jump in there too, actually, please. Dr. Peters? Sorry, I just have so one of the schools where I'm doing actually pilot research in the Bahamas is a green school, right? And so I think they also take on this collaborative approach to what they're doing in multiple levels. And I think with the intention of not being global, with the intention of just being a collaborative space where people are learning. The students actually work in multi-grade projects over the course of the year regarding the environment. It's a green school. So the first and second graders might be in charge of composting. The fifth and sixth graders last year were in charge of recycling water and actually came up with a way to transform one of the toilets in the school to being one that was using recycled water. Yeah. But they also have an expo where they actually are interacting with the community around all of these climate change topics. Nice. And one of the things that we're finding is that over the course of these collaborative projects that are really focused on their local community, right, and their local climate, that they're developing competencies that we would consider global citizenship through this process of engaging in these types of activities.
That's really exciting.
It's a byproduct of collaboration.
That's really exciting. Now's the time in the program where we're going to invite people who've been listening on the streaming to ask questions. Aaron, one of you could help facilitate that, will be great. Okay, so there's a question here from Aaron. We got a question on the chat, which I just lost.
How do you define success when it comes to global education? I think that was the question.
Yeah. Who would like to jump in there? How do you define success? It's a great question.
I'm happy to jump in, or Kirsten.
Go, Dana. Go.
Yeah. So for us, when we're looking at a whole school approach, the first thing we look at is sort of how universally and well understood is what you're trying to do. The frame, have you set up metrics? Is all of that happening? Is it understood by community? And then how pervasive is it in terms of how it shows up and how it's scaffolded? So we work with a lot of districts that might have a portrait of a graduate, but haven't actually contain language around this, but actually haven't institutionalized and embedded how to scaffold that throughout curriculum and teaching, community engagement, and the rest. So I think that's a pretty strong marker to start. But then we use our global competence matrix, which is on World Savvy's website. It's open, you can download it. And from there, essentially evaluate at the student level the development of those competencies through a variety of mechanisms. We've used exit tickets before for reflection and qualitative assessment around the ability for students to make connections between content, for example. And then we also evaluate sort of how teachers are refining their practice. How does curriculum change? How do a multitude of voices show up? How are they building trust and community and connections in their classroom? And then with respect to the leadership piece, I mean, where do they place priorities? Like when this starts to show up in budgets, budgets are a statement of values, right? And in strategic plans with specific metrics, that's when you can see this gel is something that's not sort of an add-on or a piece or something that's niche, but something that's driving conversation.
Very well done. Yeah. Any other questions, Aaron? Coming down. We really welcome them in the last closing minutes. Here. How do you propose? Can everybody see that question? Okay, here we go. I'm looking at the wrong one. Okay, how do you propose we implement and strengthen global education thinking at the local level within education? Would anybody like to have a go at that? How do you propose we implement and strengthen it's in quotes, global education thinking at the local level?
I can speak a little bit to kind of how we're thinking about that. I think that with our teachers in particular, I think teachers understand the importance of global thinking and global competence and the value in it. But I think giving them opportunities, like I said, for collaboration to see where they're already bringing in. We use the Asia Society's definition of global competence. So how they can already bring that in, how they are already bringing that into their lesson, or how little tweaks can help them strengthen that in their students. I think with our fellowship, we're also trying to talk with teachers and get them thinking about how they can build their own global competence and how they can become more globally competent educators in the classroom. And then we're talking to them about, how do you become an advocate for global education when you're speaking with your different stakeholders? So when you're speaking with your administrators, what is important to them and what elements of global education will really speak with them? When you're talking with other teachers, what is important to them and what elements of global education will resonate with them, with students, with parents? And so we're trying to do some of that work.
Kirsten, if you don't mind if I piggyback, I love what you said. I also, just to whoever posed the question, Dr. Peters, you said this in the beginning, global isn't necessarily a resonant word in a lot of places right now for reasons that we've talked about. And so one thing to think about in terms of how do you mainstream this is to, global education really at its core is inclusive, equitable, and future ready. That's what they are. And it's a tougher thing to argue with if you've been sensitized to sort of have a knee-jerk reaction to global, because for people who do, it's more what, I care about the US. I want, so reframing in a way, depending on the audience, like, you mentioned this, Kirsten, in DC, this super resonant, right? Because folks, you can hear it, touch, taste, feel it in a very visceral way. people care about this in places and get tripped up around the framing in ways that I think do a disservice to growing momentum around the movement.
Let me just add something. I think the DC's mission, you said at the beginning, Kirsten, was basically to become an anti-racist school system. If every school system did that, said that was a mission to become anti-racist, that might actually move things forward, because racism is really at the heart of some of the problems that we're facing. You know, what do you all think about that?
Go ahead, Jennifer.
Well, no, I mean, I think it would be great if that was the mission of every school district in the US. I do think, but I don't know how likely I believe that to be the case. And I thinking from a cross-national point of view, I don't necessarily believe that that's the only language that we're using in other parts of the world, and thinking about what global education looks like. And again, I would go back a little bit to sort of the conceptual clarity, like, do we mean global competencies? Do we mean global mindedness? Do we mean and in internationally mindedness? Do we mean being a citizen of the world? And I think part of that confusion, I think, and I think part of it's good. I think it relates to the stickiness that you were talking about, Dana, that it can be many things, right? But I also think it leads us down a little bit of a black hole in terms of, like, how do we assess this and know that we're sort of achieving our targets, and we can't actually completely agree about what it is that we're trying to do. So I think many things that would further anti-racist education would further global education, but I don't necessarily believe that they're the same.
They're the same. Let me just finalize, as we're coming to the end, what's the project that you want to work on now that you feel is going to lead into something promising in the future? Well, what are some of the topics or ideas or projects that you are involved with right now that suggest that they excite you and make you feel like there's a lot of potential here that we need to mine? Start with anybody there.
I mean, high level World Savvy is working on building a network of 10,000 schools across the country, with a third of them in rural communities that are centering global competence in a whole school and district model. And what excites me about that, even though it feels a little bit bigger than a project, it's sort of like what our Vision 2035 is that I think for this to be sticky and accessible, and ironically, Jennifer, what you said is so true, but the harder we try and nail down what global competence is, you ironically end up upending what global competence is meant to be, which is relative and contextual, right? So the 10 most important facts for us to know, we're all sitting in the United States right now, would be totally different if you're somewhere else in the world, right? And so the comfort with the ambiguity about that challenges some of the assessment, but for us, building that network of 10,000 schools is a way to say, to your point, Jennifer, how do schools make meaning of this in ways that are resonant for their community while still moving towards the same North Star? And so part of that is not just to grow a network, Dr. Peters, but also to have a substantial group of schools who are all learning from and with one another as the world changes.
Very well, that's great. Jennifer, would you like to talk about your?
Yeah, I mean, it's two spaces, and I think one of them, like the work that you think World Savvy is doing, is really important. In that, I think a lot of our efforts to think about what this looks like and whether our students are globally competent are all happening. A majority of it is happening, particularly the assessment, in the high school space. It's like the 15 plus. If you actually look in the research, there are over 150 instruments to measure global competencies and global citizenship around the world. PISA and the Asia Society seem to be getting a lot of people on board in recent years, but there are a lot of ways to think about this. And I really believe, as a former primary school teacher in East Asia, that all of this has to be starting when kids are young and in primary schools. And so thinking about what this looks like in the sort of K through 6 space, I think, is a really important area to move forward. And then myself, I've been really trying to think about in my research how to link this idea of being a global citizen to other desirable outcomes, in hope that one of the ways we can push this forward in the US is by convincing people that these outcomes that we care about can actually happen through the pathway of global citizenship education, not just in and of itself. So,
Kirsten, do you want to say some things you're busy with?
Yeah, I think so. I'm actually relatively new to DCPS. So I started in December, and I think that COVID has thrown all of us for a loop. So our goal moving forward is really reconnecting with our global studies schools that we currently have and trying to expand that, because I think that full school model is just so valuable in the impact that it can have. So that is one of the things that we're working toward, and we're working toward the framing for that model and bringing in our current global studies schools for feedback to make sure that we have the right implementation guide for moving forward with that. So that's some of the work that we're working on right now. We also, so in the past, before I started and before COVID, we had a global scholar certificate. And so a transcript and diploma recognition for students. And so we're working on bringing that back for students and having that tangible piece of their different experiences throughout their time at DCPS with the reflection, and then having that recognition. So,
all right. There's one last question that's come in over the transom. What do you all think is global education's role in recentering critical multidisciplinary discussions and historical tracings of race, anti-Black racism, etc., when global and international education as a field is bound up in its own colonial Western supremacist history?
Critical, essential. I mean, I think what I said earlier, like much like the teaching profession, global ed has way more white women as the folks who are, you know, in this conversation today in the United States than that, you know, that's one area to tackle. But also, I don't think you can address global competence without addressing those things and unpacking and unlearning and making that the center of the conversation. So yeah, I think it's a critical role. They're not separate things to me.
Okay. I'm sharing the screen because we want to give some final credit to everybody who's participated. It's been a fabulous panel. And I hope people out there really appreciated how much, as much as I did, the contributions of everybody. And I hope it's maybe the first of a kind, when we're first of a series of discussions that we can have around this topic.
And
yes,
Dr. Peters, sorry to interrupt, but on that note, at the bottom of the slide you're about to share, if folks are interested in continuing the conversation, the Global Learning for an Open World Conference is happening in November online and has thousands of educators from across the globe. So if you're watching and you want to present, it's free, it's open, it's run by Actionable Innovations and Lucy Gray and Bill Rankin. So, so there's information at the bottom in a QR code, and hopefully Jennifer and Kirsten will also join us there.
That's great. I'm glad you're doing that. That's really, any other final plugs that anybody wants to make? I really thank everybody. This is really good and so valuable and so helpful. You brought a lot of interesting issues to life. The contributions of DC Public Schools, we can learn a lot from all you're doing there, a lot of the activities. And I'm just amazed at, Dana, your ability to move in so many different areas, in school boards, setting up new schools, thinking about curriculum changes, being a real advocate for this amazing area, and being politically savvy at the same time, and navigating through all the thorn bushes around. And Jennifer, your exciting work internationally is really a great contribution and helps us put all of this in perspective. So we can't kind of get ourselves a little bit, again, with this kind of American exceptionalist idea that we're somehow new and we've got so many, the best ideas. We don't have the best ideas. We have some ideas. And I think together with other people and collaborations, we can really make a difference. So, loved it, and I hope everybody else out there did. And please send us feedback and comments as you will. Thank you.